An endless, rolling fog blanketed the view outside the window, so thick it seemed as if the entire world had disappeared into its depths. Only a chaotic, dim light managed to penetrate the fog, casting a half-lit glow within the quiet stone house. Inside the slightly disheveled dwelling sat Alexander, hunched over his desk. He had unceremoniously pushed aside the clutter on his desk, and now, looking haggard, he was writing feverishly. Day 7, the situation remains unchanged. A thick fog obscures everything outside the window itself sealed shut by an unknown force. The entire stone house seems to have been cast into some kind of abnormal space. I can't communicate with the outside world, there's no water source, but the oil lamp keeps burning, and the parchment is still usable, even though I've already pulled out its parchment pen. A faint sound, like a breeze, seemed to come from the direction of the window. Alexander, who was engrossed in his writing, abruptly looked up, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. But within a second, he realized it was just his imagination. The only thing outside the window was the unyielding, pale fog, a silent world coldly enveloping his small stone house. His gaze swept over the windowsill, landing on a discarded hammer and chisel, traces of his attempts to escape the stone house in the past few days. Now, these robust tools lay there silently, seemingly mocking his dire situation. Several seconds later, Alexander's expression regained its calm. With this eerie calmness, he lowered his head again, returning to his writing. I'm trapped, utterly clueless about how to escape. Over the past few days, I've even tried dismantling the stone roof, walls, and floor, but despite using all my strength, I couldn't leave the slightest mark. This stone house has become like a box cast together with space, with no way out, except for that door. But what's outside that door is even stranger. Alexander paused again, slowly examining the words he'd just written. He idly flipped through the parchment roll, looking at the things he'd written over the past few days, suppressed words, meaningless musings, frustrated doodles, and jokes he'd written to try and lift his spirits. He didn't know what the point of writing all this was, who might read these ramblings in the future, or even whether he was a person who enjoyed recording his daily life. As a scholar with limited free time, he didn't have much energy to devote to such things. But now, whether he liked it or not, he had plenty of free time. After waking up one day, he found himself trapped in his own stone house. The world outside the window was enveloped in an unending fog so thick he couldn't see anything else. The world seemed to have lost its cycle of day and night, the stone house filled with a constant, dim light for 24 hours a day. The window was locked, the water supply cut off, the carrier pigeons unresponsive. No matter how much noise he made in the stone house, he couldn't attract any outside help. It was as if he was in a ludicrous nightmare, where everything operated against the laws of nature. But Alexander had exhausted all means to confirm one thing: there were no illusions here, no dreams, only an abnormal world and a still relatively normal self. He took a deep breath, his gaze finally settling on the single door at the end of the stone house. An ordinary, cheap iron door, still adorned with a calendar he'd forgotten to change from the year before. The iron door handle was polished bright, and the stone slab in front of the door was slightly askew. That door could be opened. If this stone room was like a prison, then the most cruel part of this prison was that it actually retained a door that could be opened at any time, constantly tempting the prisoner to leave, but beyond that door was not that outside that Alexander desired. There were no castle corridors paved with stone slabs, no bustling markets bathed in sunlight, no familiar faces, nothing he recognized. There was only a strange and unsettling foreign land, and there was also an inescapable predicament. But Alexander knew that he didn't have much time left to hesitate, and the so-called choice never existed in the first place. His food supply was limited, and he had only a quarter of a few jugs of water left. He had tried all possible ways to escape and ask for help in this enclosed room. Now, the only path left for him was to prepare to go to the other side of the door, where he might find a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he might even have a chance to investigate what caused the bizarre and awkward supernatural situation he was in now. Alexander took a light breath, and lowered his head to leave the last few sections on the parchment roll, but no matter what, the only choice now is to go to the other side of the door. At least on that strange ship, I can find something to eat, and the explorations and preparations I've made over the past few days should be enough to keep me alive on that ship, even though the preparations I can make there are really limited. Finally, to whoever comes after me, if I don't make it back and one day some rescue team or something opens this room and sees this parchment roll, please don't take what I've written as a ludicrous story, it really happened. As creepy as it is, there really was a man named Alexander, trapped in a bizarre, crazy space-time anomaly. I've done my best to describe the various abnormal phenomena I've seen in this parchment roll, and recorded all the efforts I've made to escape. If there really are any people who come after, please at least remember my name, and remember that all this really happened. Alexander closed the parchment roll, threw the pen into the storage box next to him, and slowly stood up from behind the desk. It was time to leave, before he was completely passive and trapped. But after a brief thought, he didn't go straight to the only door that could lead to the outside. Instead, he went straight to his simple wooden bed. He had to face the foreign land on the other side of the door in the best possible state, and he wasn't in a good state right now, especially mentally. Alexander didn't know if he could sleep, but even forcing himself to lie in bed and empty his mind was better than going to the other side while mentally exhausted. 8 hours later, Alexander opened his eyes. The chaotic fog was still outside the window, and the light of day and night was still oppressively dim. Alexander ignored the situation outside the window. He took some food from his dwindling supplies and ate until he was 80% full. Then he went to the copper mirror in the corner of the secret room. The man in the mirror was still disheveled, looking rather ragged, and had no notable qualities. But Alexander stared hard at his reflection, as if trying to permanently imprint this image in his mind. He stared at the mirror for several minutes, then spoke softly to himself, as if speaking to the person in the mirror. Your name is Alexander, at least on this side, your name is Alexander. Always remember that. After that, he turned and left. Coming to the all-too-familiar iron door, Alexander took a deep breath and placed his hand on the handle. Aside from his clothes, Alexander didn't carry anything extra. He didn't bring any food or defensive equipment, a lesson learned from previous explorations. He couldn't bring anything through the iron door other than himself. In fact, he even questioned whether this self was the same, because Alexander turned the handle and pushed open the iron door. A pulsating, gray-black fog appeared before him like a curtain, and through the fluctuating fog, he seemed to already hear the sound of the sea. Stepping through the fog, the slightly salty sea breeze hit him in the face. The illusory sound of the waves became real, and he could feel a slight swaying under his feet. After a brief moment of dizziness, Alexander opened his eyes to a vast wooden deck, towering mast standing under the dark clouds, and a boundless sea that was slightly undulating outside the ship's side. Alexander looked down to see a body that was more robust than he remembered, a finely made and expensive-looking but completely unfamiliar captain's uniform, a pair of hands with large joints, and a beautifully crafted antique black musket in his hand. Yes, even the self had to be questioned. This wasn't the first time Alexander had passed through this door to the other side. Several days ago, Alexander woke up to find himself trapped in his cabin by some sort of vision after a thick, eerie fog had obscured the entire world. He then discovered this strange place on the other side of the door. After all, that door was now the only exit from his cabin, but he still remembered his confusion and helplessness when he first opened the door and found a deck outside, and even more so when he first looked down to see his body had changed. But since then, in order to seek opportunities to break the predicament, he had bravely explored this side several times successfully. Even though he still didn't understand what had happened to him, and didn't understand the situation of this strange ship appearing outside his door, at least he had gained some experience and had a preliminary understanding of this ship. With previous times, Alexander forced himself to shake off the dizziness from passing through the door in the shortest possible time, then immediately checked the condition of this body. He checked the short sword in his hand, comparing all the details from memory, finally confirming that the items he was carrying were consistent with those when he left the deck last time. It seems that every time I pass through this door, my body seamlessly switches. If I could place an observation crystal ball on this side of the deck, then I could confirm whether this body changes when I push open the captain's cabin door to return to the inner room of the cabin. Unfortunately, items from the two worlds cannot pass through the door, and there's no way to bring the observation crystal ball over. But the handheld magic mirror I left in the cabin did record the scene when I passed through the door from the other side. I did indeed walk through that black fog. So is it true that my body changed into this form when it passed through the black fog? Alexander muttered to himself. He knew that he might look ridiculous standing on the deck talking to himself, but he needed to make some noise. On this deserted, eerie ghost ship, he needed some evidence to prove that he was still alive. A salty sea breeze blew across the deck, stirring the dark blue captain's robe of unknown material that he was wearing. Alexander sighed softly, but instead of heading towards the deck, he turned around to look at the door behind him. He placed his hand on the doorknob, twist the doorknob, and then all he had to do was push the door inward, and he would see a thick, gray-black fog. Pass through the fog, and he would return to the solitary cottage he had lived in for many years. He gripped the doorknob, pulling the door outwards, the slightly heavy oak door creaked, and inside was a somewhat dim cabin. Under the dim light, one could see the exquisite tapestries hanging on the walls, the shelves filled with various ornaments, and the large navigation table in the center of the room. There was also a small door at the deepest part of the room, in front of which was a burgundy carpet. Push the door open, and he would return to his solitary cottage. Pull the door open, and it would be the captain's cabin, and the latter was obviously the normal facility on this ship. Alexander stepped into the captain's cabin. As he passed the doorway, he habitually looked to the left. A full-length mirror was fixed to the wall next to him. In the mirror, Alexander's current appearance was clearly reflected. It was a tall man with long black hair, a majestic beard, deep-set eye sockets, and a commanding aura that seemed to emanate from his very appearance. He looked as though he was over 40, but his heroic appearance and oppressive gaze seemed to blur this sense of age, while his finely crafted captain's robe further highlighted the special status of the man in the mirror. Alexander moved his neck a bit, then made a face at the mirror. He thought of himself as a friendly and amiable person, and the image in the mirror didn't quite match his temperament. But he quickly gave up the attempt, feeling that instead of appearing friendlier, he now looked less like a stern captain and more like a psychopathic serial killer in the mirror. As Alexander was making these movements, a faint clicking sound came from the direction of the navigation table. He looked in the direction of the sound without surprise and saw a wooden unicorn head on the table slowly turning its face towards him. The lifeless chunk of wood seemed to come alive at this moment, its black gemstone eyes looking at him intently. The panic of the first time he saw this eerie scene flashed through his mind, but Alexander just raised the corner of his mouth. He walked towards the navigation table, and the wooden unicorn head also turned its neck bit by bit. A hoarse, gloomy voice came from its wooden throat. "Name?" "Alexander Blackwood," Alexander replied calmly. The voice of the wooden unicorn head instantly became warm and friendly. "Good morning, Captain. I'm glad to see you still remember your name. How are you feeling today? How is your health? Did you sleep well last night? I hope you had a good dream. Also, today is a good day to set sail. The sea is calm, the wind is right, it's cool and comfortable, and there are no annoying navy or noisy crew. Captain, do you know a noisy crew? You're noisy enough." Although it wasn't the first time dealing with this strange unicorn head, Alexander still felt his brain shudder. He glared at it and his voice squeezed out through his teeth. "Quiet." Oh, of course, Captain. You like quiet. Your loyal first mate and second mate and bosun and sailor and lookout know this very well. Keeping quiet has many benefits. There was once a leader in the field of medicine, or perhaps philosophy or architecture. Alexander now felt not only his brain shuddering, but even his bronchial tubes started to shake. "What I mean is, I command you to be quiet." As soon as the word "command" came out, the unicorn head finally quieted down. Alexander then let out a sigh of relief, walked over to the navigation table and sat down. Now, he was the captain of this empty ghost ship. Alexander Blackwood, a strange name, a tongue-twister surname. From the moment he first passed through that black fog and boarded this ghost ship, he knew all this in his mind. He knew that his body on this side was called Alexander. He knew that he was the owner of this ship. He knew that this ship was sailing on a long journey far beyond imagination. He knew this, but only this. The memories remaining in his mind were vague and thin, so much so that there were only the above key sections, and the rest of the details were completely blank. It was as if he knew that this ship had an amazing voyage plan, but he had no idea where it was going. The original owner of this ship, the real Alexander Blackwood, seemed to have died a long time ago, and the things that remained in Alexander's mind were more like a ghost captain's most intense, deepest impressions left in the world after he died completely. Instinct told Alexander that there was a big problem behind the identity of Captain Alexander Blackwood, especially in the presence of supernatural phenomena, the talking wooden unicorn head, on this ghost ship, the mystery of this Alexander captain might even mean some danger that he had never imagined, but he had to take on this name to move safely on this ship, because, like the wooden unicorn head on the navigation table just now, some things on this ship are always trying to confirm the identity of the captain. Even the ship itself is always confirming the identity of the captain. This gave the impression that it was some kind of insurance measure, as if the captain of this ship could really forget his name at any time, and once he forgot his name, something extremely terrible and dangerous would happen. So, check measures had to be set up everywhere on the ship. Alexander didn't know what the consequences would be if Captain Alexander forgot his name, but he believed that there would definitely be no good consequences if he said his name wrong. After all, even the wooden unicorn head on the navigation table didn't look like a good guy, but if he took on the name of Alexander Blackwood, then everything on this ship seemed quite friendly. Anyway, they didn't seem very intelligent. Alexander, perhaps should be called Alexander now. Alexander ended his brief contemplation and memories, then looked at the sea chart spread out on the stone table. However, there were no identifiable routes, markers, or land on the chart. Not even an island could be seen. All that could be seen on its rough, thick parchment surface were large areas of black clumps constantly churning and surging like a fog, as if the black, fog-like things were obscuring the original routes on the paper. The only thing that could be seen in the center of the chart was a ship silhouette that appeared and disappeared in the thick fog. Alexander had no sailing experience in his past decades of life, but even those who didn't know sea charts would definitely know that normal sea charts didn't look like this. Obviously, like the wooden unicorn head on the stone table, this sea chart was also some kind of supernatural item, but Alexander hadn't yet figured out its usage rules. It seemed to notice that the captain's attention was finally on the sea chart. The unicorn head that had been quiet for a long time on the stone table finally moved again. It started to make a clicking sound, its neck also twisting slightly. At first, it was quite restrained, but soon the clicking sound became too noticeable to ignore. In the end, the whole head started to shake crazily on its base like it was in vibration mode. Fearing that this thing would start a fire on his navigation table if it kept twitching, Alexander finally looked at it. "Speak." "Yes, Captain, I must emphasize again that today is a good day to set sail. The ghost ship is as always waiting for your command. Shall we hoist the sails? The wooden unicorn head, with its hard, black face, stared at Alexander who sat behind the navigation table. The obsidian eyes seemed to flow with a strange light. Although this thing has no ability to express emotions, Alexander clearly read a sense of anticipation from its wooden face. This was not the first time the unicorn head urged him to set sail. Every time he came here, the unicorn head would do so. He even felt that the ship was constantly urging him, asking him to end this blind drift at sea as soon as possible and return to the right course. However, Alexander fell silent. His naturally imposing face was now covered with clouds. In his contemplation and silence, he realized two problems clearly. Firstly, he was the only one on this massive ship. As a sail-powered ship, the Wanderer was insanely large by Alexander's rough estimate, at least 150 to 200 meters long. To control such a behemoth, he would need dozens or even hundreds of experienced sailors. How could he do it alone? Secondly, aside from these professional factors, there was another key problem blocking his voyage. He didn't know how to sail. Alexander was a bit anxious. He tried to imagine what would happen if he asked the strange and noisy unicorn head for sailing advice. The result made him even more anxious. However, the unicorn head didn't know what its captain was thinking. It just asked, "Captain, do you have any concerns? If you're worried about the Wanderer, you can rest assured. The Wanderer is always ready to sail with you to the end of the world. Or are you worried about setting sail today being ill-fated? I have some knowledge of divination." What kind of divination do you believe in? Astronomy, incense, crystals. Speaking of crystals, do you remember? Alexander tried to keep a straight face, suppressing the urge to fight the unicorn head in front of him, and said in a deep voice, "I'll go to the deck to check the situation first, you stay here quietly." "As you wish, but I must remind you, the Wanderer has been drifting aimlessly for too long. You must take control of it as soon as possible, and get this voyage back on track," the unicorn head said, and with the sound of wood rubbing, it finally returned to its original posture. Alexander suddenly felt the world had quieted down. He took a deep breath, and his brain gradually calmed down. Then he picked up the flintlock on the table and left the captain's cabin. This seemingly old flintlock was something he found while exploring the ship. He also found a knight's sword, which was now hanging from his waist. These two items were his sense of security while moving around the ship. During his exploration over the past few days, he spent a long time learning roughly how to use these two items, even though so far, he hadn't seen any living creatures on this ship besides himself. Talking objects don't count. The salty sea breeze hit his face, and Alexander's slightly irritated mood calmed down. He came to the deck outside the captain's cabin and instinctively looked up at the sky. The thick clouds still covered the sky as far as he could see. There were no sun, moon, or stars in the clouds, only murky daylight illuminating the boundless ocean. This sight had lasted for a long time. In fact, ever since Alexander came to this ship, he had only seen such a sky. It even made him doubt whether this world had normal weather at all. Was this gloomy sky the eternal weather in this sea area? Alexander turned around. He saw the door to the captain's cabin standing quietly there. Above the door was a beam with a line of letters he didn't recognize. But when his gaze focused on the line, its meaning was directly reflected in his mind. Door of the Wanderer. Door of the Wanderer. The Wanderer, huh, Alexander muttered to himself, then added with a hint of self-mockery, "This ship does have a good name." He then walked around the captain's cabin, followed the stairs along the edge of the deck to the upper deck at the stern. There was a wooden platform there, and the place with the most open view of the ship besides the lookout was here. A heavy black steering wheel was quietly waiting for the helmsman to arrive on the platform. Alexander frowned. For some reason, he suddenly felt a sense of urgency and anxiety, as if it had suddenly occurred when he saw the steering wheel. He hadn't felt this way the few times he had been here before. As if to respond to his anxiety, a sudden, chaotic wind blew across the deck. The originally calm sea surface also instantly stirred up waves. Although the wind and waves were not enough to affect the massive Wanderer, Alexander was alarmed. The next second, driven by instinct, he looked in the direction of the bow of the ship. On the sea surface directly in front of the Wanderer, between the chaotic and hazy sky and sea, an endless, wall-like white fog suddenly appeared, making him instantly widen his eyes. That fog, like a barrier that surrounded and isolated the entire world, was overwhelming like a wall connecting heaven and earth, and its breathtaking scale made Alexander more cautious. It reminded him instantly of the boundless fog outside the window of his apartment. The Wanderer was heading straight for that wall of fog. Alexander didn't know what the fog was, nor what was in the depths of the fog, but he instinctively felt a great danger. His survival instinct told him that being swallowed by that fog was not a good thing. He instinctively rushed to the platform where the steering wheel was. A huge sense of powerlessness also came over him. Even if he took the helm, how could he, alone, steer this huge ship away from that wall of fog? But he still instinctively came to the steering wheel, and almost at the same time, he heard a hoarse, dark voice coming from a copper speaking tube next to the steering wheel that was connected to the captain's cabin. It was the voice of the wooden unicorn head. Its tone was surprisingly panicked this time. "Captain, a reality collapse has appeared ahead. We are approaching the edge of reality. Please adjust the course immediately." Listening to the panicked voice of the wooden unicorn head, Alexander almost cursed out loud. "Adjusting the course sounds easy. Why don't you conjure up 100 or 80 good brothers who know how to sail and get this thing moving?" Immediately after, he looked up again in the direction of the mast, seeing nothing but a few bare masts standing on the deck, feeling even more desolate. Don't even mention hoisting the sail. In fact, there was no sail on this ship at all. Those poles were all empty. In his emotional agitation, he didn't even have time to think carefully about the strange words that the wooden unicorn head had just blurted out. All he knew was to instinctively grab the steering wheel of the Wanderer, which seemed to be trembling slightly. For several days, this was the first time he had voluntarily placed his hand on the steering wheel of the Wanderer. The strange circumstances on the ship and the repeated urging of the wooden unicorn head had always made him doubtful, and he had been resistant to the idea of taking the helm. But now, he no longer had the chance to hesitate. Alexander tightly gripped the steering wheel. His blank mind didn't even have time to think about how he could control a ghost ship that was empty and unmanned. The change happened in the next instant. A sound like a mountain roar and a tsunami exploded in Alexander's mind. It was as if 10,000 cheering people were standing on the shore bidding farewell to a ship, as if hundreds of sailors were shouting the captain's name on the deck, and in between, there seemed to be a desolate sea shanty and invisible waves. A green flame emerged on the edge of his vision, and Alexander instinctively looked at his palm. He saw a green flame suddenly burst from the steering wheel of the Wanderer and quickly spread across his body, covering him in an instant. In the burning flames, his flesh and blood body suddenly became hollow and illusory. His captain's uniform was as worn and ragged as if it had been soaked in seawater for decades. Under his flesh and blood, which had suddenly become ghostly, Alexander could even vaguely see his own skeleton. The fire was dancing on the crystal-like bones, and the everlasting flame was flowing through his body like water. However, he felt no pain or burning. In the raging fire, he only felt his senses spreading in all directions. The fire spread from the helm down to the deck, the hull, and the mast. The flames intertwined like a net, rising from the deck like a breath, spreading along the lonely mast, and finally weaving into a huge sail in the sea and fog. The Wanderer set sail, right in front of this rapidly collapsing reality border. "We've fallen into the realm of souls." The blaring and eerie call of the horned sprite, with its strange sense of courageous advancement, finally ceased. Its cries seemed to come from a distant place, interspersed with countless low murmurs, as if surrounded by malicious voices. "But the soul ship hasn't completely sunk yet. Captain, hold the helm. The soul ship still has the power to maintain its course before sinking into the deep sea. We can still get out. The precondition is that I need to know where to go," roared Leonard, his voice mixed with the crackling sound of green flames burning, as if coming from hell. "I've lost my sense of direction." "Instinct, Captain, instinct," the horned sprite shouted through the copper pipe. "Your instinct is more accurate than the lines on the sea chart, Leonard." A sense of powerlessness surged up, but Leonard had no extra energy to quarrel with a weird horned sprite. Since the other party said to go with instinct, he decided to be brash. Following the lingering feeling before the fog rose, he grasped the helm in his hand and turned it hard in the direction he believed. The soul ship let out a series of hair-raising howls from top to bottom. The huge ship body drew an astonishing arc on the sea surface that had turned completely dark. The wind was howling, the fog was swirling, and in the dim sky and fog, Leonard's peripheral vision suddenly caught something gradually emerging in the fog. The next second, he found it to be a ship, a white ship with a black chimney in the middle of the ship, which looked a bit smaller than the soul ship. At the end of the beautiful arc drawn by the soul ship, the ship that suddenly emerged from the fog was coming straight over, or rather, the soul ship was going straight over. The only thing left in Leonard's heart was a scream. "My God, there's been an accident in the navigation of the soul ship." He had been exploring in this weird world for so long and hadn't seen any other living people. Why did a ship suddenly appear at this time? What are the odds of this double rendezvous? The wind was howling, the waves were surging, and the boundless sea was releasing its terrifying power. In the face of this natural force that was enough to tear apart the extraordinary strong, the birch was squeezing out the last bit of power from its steam power device to resist its fate of death. Captain Leonard Clayton with his white hair stood in the cockpit. However, the sturdy walls and crystal windows of the cockpit couldn't give him any sense of security. He held the helm tightly, and the groaning and convulsions of the birch in its dying moments seemed to rush into his mind directly through the series of gears and connecting rods behind the helm. Through the wide window, he clearly saw the astonishing waves outside the ship's side. But what was even more terrifying than the astonishing waves was the eerie dense fog that was rising and spreading over the sea in the distance, and the shadowy thunder and lightning in the fog. The Baihua is the most advanced magic-powered ship in the world, but even the most advanced equipment can only ensure that the ship is powerful in normal sea areas. However, what it and its captain are now facing is the collapsing edge of the present world, and the bone-chilling cold that is spreading from the foul palaces of the evil gods at the bottom of the abyss. "Captain!" The priest can't hold on any longer. The first mate's mournful shout came from the side. From his voice, Leonard heard a slight hoarse echo. He then looked in front of the cockpit and saw ominous purple-black flames rising from the sacred incense burner placed on the prayer altar. The respectable and loyal clergyman in a deep blue robe was sitting in front of the sacred incense burner, trembling all over. His mouth and nose were full of blood, and the colors of madness and clarity alternated in his eyes. A heavy feeling sank in Leonard's heart that he knew that the respectable priest was still on the side of humanity, using his last devout faith and pure holy soul to resist the call from the bottom of the abyss. But this persistence was already at its last gasp, and the purple-black smoke coming out of the sacred incense burner was a clear sign of the breakthrough of pollution. Once the priest falls, every conscious mind on this ship could potentially become a gateway to the deep sea, or even to the dark realm. "Captain!" The voice of the first mate came again from the side. Leonard cut him off, and the middle-aged captain's face was full of determination at this moment. "Temporarily shut down the holy light guidance, we are sinking into the spirit realm." The first mate was dumbfounded, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "Captain? Sinking into the spirit realm, this way, at least for the next 10 minutes, we can avoid the fiercest wave of the edge collapse, and the priest has a chance to recover," Leonard ordered again in an unquestionable tone, this time with 2 more explanations. "Execute my command." The first mate opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something else, but then he gritted his teeth. "You are the captain." The crew began to execute the captain's orders quickly. Leonard, who was steering the ship himself, took a deep breath. The holy light guidance in the depths of the cabin was gradually dying out. He could feel the invisible protective field around the Baihua was rapidly weakening. Without the protection of the sacred object, the ship was slowly sinking into the spirit realm layer between the present world and the deep sea. A thin fog appeared on the surrounding sea surface, and the sea water was gradually darkening. It was very dangerous, but in history, it was not uncommon for ships to return to the human world from the spirit realm. As a member of the Explorers Association, he had read countless books on this subject, as well as various survival guides written by survivors. How much worse could it get? He just needed the Baihua to dodge a storm on the edge of the spirit realm, and then use the surging power output of the advanced magic drive to make a thrilling soul crossing. If luck was still on his side, he could lead his crew back to the human world. Then he would quickly hand over the damn mysterious item 099 in the cargo hold to the Lord of the Bergamo Federation, and never meddle in the affairs of the authorities for the rest of his life. It couldn't get any worse, Leonard comforted himself. Then he saw a 3-masted ship, a full circle larger than the Baihua, suddenly appear on the distant sea surface that had suddenly become pitch black. With some kind of unstoppable momentum, it drew a heart-stopping arc and crashed head-on. Captain Leonard stared blankly at the front. "Oh, my God!" The colossal shadow thundered towards them, and every soul on board the Birch beheld a sight that would be etched in their memories for a lifetime. It was an ancient and majestic 3-masted warship. In an era when steamships were common, this sailing warship emerging from the fog seemed as if it had stepped out of an oil painting from a century ago. Its masts towered high, its hull was steep, and its black wooden shell was aflame with ghostly green fire. The enormous sails billowed in the void, adorned with the apparitions of roaring flames. Such a spectacle, even on the vast and treacherous Odyssean seas, only existed in the terrifying tales of maritime disasters. "We're going to crash!" a sailor cried out. These rough and tough seafarers, accustomed to the life at sea, were visibly shaken by the massive entity before them. They shouted and ran, some seeking refuge on the deck, some clutching anything that could secure them, and some even fell to their knees in the tumult of waves, praying fervently to the storm goddess Mona or the death deity Bardo with unprecedented devotion. On the vast Odyssean seas, the blessings of gods had faded, but these 2 deities still watched over all their subjects with equal concern. However, not all the sailors had lost their cool. The first mate immediately turned to the captain, his most trusted figure. He knew that navigating the vast Odyssean seas was fraught with danger and that the experienced captain was always the key to the fate of the entire ship. With over 3 decades at sea, Captain Reynard, now in his 50s, might not be as robust as in his youth, but his survival experience might still offer a glimmer of hope for everyone. The ship emerging from the fog didn't seem to be sailing in the real world. Instead, it seemed like something that had emerged from the spirit world or deeper. If it was a supernatural phenomenon, perhaps it could be countered with some supernatural force. The old captains sailing on the vast Odyssean seas had some experience dealing with supernatural phenomena. However, the first mate saw only fear and shock in the captain's face. The old captain held the ship's wheel motionless, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the entire ship was shrouded in shadow. He stared at the crushing ship's shadow in front of him, his face as rigid as a piece of stone. He finally squeezed out a few words that were colder than the icy sea wind. "It's the Wanderer." "Captain." The first mate jumped at the name that floated into his ears. Like every person making a living on the vast Odyssean seas, he had heard the name from many older, more experienced and superstitious sailors. "What did you say?" "That. The Wanderer." Captain Reynard seemed not to hear the first mate's voice. He gripped the birch's wheel as if he was roaring at something. Almost simultaneously, the mighty hull of the Wanderer finally touched the bow of the birch. Almost all the sailors screamed. But the expected earth-shattering collision did not occur. The massive ship ablaze with green flames seemed to be a grand illusion. It swept across the deck of the birch with a whooshing flame apparition. The thick hull, the gloomy cabins, the dimly lit corridors, the burning keel and pillars. The sailors watched in horror as they crashed into the phantom ship, and the green flames on the ghost ship swept past them like a fire net. Reynard watched as the flame roared towards him. But before that, he saw the flames sweep over his chief officer. The chief officer's body suddenly turned into a ghostly spirit in the phantom flame, the skeleton in the spirit burning like firewood. He saw a clergyman next to the prayer table, the flames on him flickering as if the god behind him was still using a meager blessing to protect him from being swallowed by the Wanderer. Then the fire burned on Reynard. He saw the same change in his body, and a strong sense of fatigue, submission, and fear engulfed him. The sea god amulet he carried began to work. A sensation of burning and cooling alternately barely maintained his sanity. In his remaining sanity, he passed through the cabins and corridors of the Wanderer. The gloomy and oppressive cabin came rushing towards him and then whooshed away. The ancient wooden pillars burning with green fire were entwined with rotten ropes and barnacles. He saw a huge cargo hold, where all sorts of strange things that should have been buried in the deep sea lay quietly. He saw a luxurious cabin, with a unicorn head placed on the table in the center. The sheep's head turned and looked coldly into Reynard's eyes. Finally, Reynard gathered all his strength to look up. He saw the figure holding the ship's wheel. The tall figure in a black sailor's uniform was as majestic and terrifying as the master of a nightmare, ruling all the ghostly flames. Even the sea that was deep in the spirit world seemed to be in awe of his majesty, and a rift was torn open behind him. Reynard resignedly closed his eyes. He knew he was now part of the Wanderer. The nightmarish captain needed some sacrifices to satisfy his endless emptiness and loneliness. But the next second, he forced his eyes open with all his courage. He felt all the courage and madness of his life seemed to converge in these few seconds. He recalled the knowledge he had gained from books and legends and looked at the terrifying captain on the Wanderer with as much honesty and calm as possible. "You don't have to take everyone, take me, spare my crew." But the tall figure did not respond. He just coldly cast his gaze over, seeming a bit curious, as if wondering why a mere human captain would dare to bargain with him. Reynard couldn't help but roar, "They all have families and loved ones." The figure standing on the Wanderer finally reacted. He looked at Reynard and seemed to say something, but a loud whooshing sound came from the side. In the whooshing sound, Reynard heard some noise but couldn't make out a single word. The response from the Wanderer was lost in the howling of the waves. "What did you say?" "I can't hear you over the wind." The next second, a loud noise rushed into Reynard's ears, mixed with the sound of the wind, the waves, and the sailors' shouts outside the ship. He saw the green flames quickly fade from the corner of his eye, and the last remaining phantom of the Wanderer was dissipating like mist from the air. Reynard took a deep breath and then noticed that his hands, which had been burnt to ashes by the green flames, had returned to their original state. Even the others in the control room had turned back into flesh and blood. The devout priest was panting heavily next to the prayer table, constantly chanting the name of the storm goddess Mona, and the ominous purple-black smoke in the incense burner had gradually dissipated. Rising from the bronze burner was pure white smoke. It took Reynard a while to catch his breath. He looked around in disbelief, as if he couldn't believe that the nightmare had just ended. Not until the chief officer's voice came from the side, "Captain. That ship, the Wanderer, has left." Reynard was somewhat dazed, and after a few seconds, he murmured, "He actually let us go." The chief officer didn't hear clearly. "Captain? What did you say?" "That Alexander Captain." Reynard mumbled subconsciously, but then he slapped himself as if he had accidentally mentioned a taboo word. He suddenly looked up at the chief officer. "Roll call for the whole ship, quick. See who's missing." The chief officer immediately nodded and took the order, but just as he was about to leave, Reynard called out to him again, "And see if there's anyone extra on the ship." The chief officer paused, then seemed to understand. His eyes filled with a touch of fear. He took a deep breath, whispered the name of the storm goddess, and then quickly ran out onto the deck. On the birch, still sailing in a ghostly state, the assembly bell rang like a death knell. The bell rang urgently, accompanied by the chaotic footsteps of the sailors. Captain Leonard, his first mate, and the still panting Father Ronald were left in the cabin. The old captain looked out at the sea. The birch was still in the abyss of the demonic world. The sea beyond the ship's side was shrouded in mist, and the water was still as dark as ink, but the storm had ceased. The dreadful lost Wanderer was nowhere to be found, giving the illusion as though the previous storm and even the collapse of the reality border were all caused by that ghost ship, and now all the disasters had left the birch with the departure of that ship. Leonard thought of the terrifying legends about the lost Wanderer and its captain, Duncan Alexander, thought of the fleet swallowed by the reality border over a century ago, and the ships that sank into the shadow abyss during encounters with the Lost Wanderer. Suddenly, he felt this was not an impossible scenario. But regardless, now that the Lost Wanderer had left, the surrounding sea had temporarily returned to calm. Although they were still in the dangerous abyss of the demonic world, at least he and his crew had a chance to catch their breath. Next, Leonard had to determine what exactly the Lost Wanderer had taken from the birch, or what it had left behind. And he had to determine it quickly. Without ruling out all hidden dangers, he dared not rashly let the ship float to the human world, because some things brought out from the demonic world would cause terrible pollution in the human world. But if they stayed in the abyss of the demonic world for too long, he and his crew would still be irreversibly affected. Listening to the noisy sounds coming from the deck, Leonard suddenly raised his head from his thoughts. He looked at Ronald, who was sitting in front of the incense burner, his face slightly improved, with a serious expression. "Father Ronald, how is our stability now?" The priest coughed twice, then took out a beautifully designed compass from his chest, engraved with many marine symbols and holy symbols. After snapping open the metal lid, the needle on the compass immediately spun rapidly, eventually stopping at a certain position. "We are staying on the surface of the demonic world, slightly closer to the human world. The influence from the shadow abyss is very weak." Ronald looked at the state of the compass needle, his expression was somewhat confused. "Strange, we are completely stable here. In the case of closing the holy object, there is almost no sinking." Cough, cough. "Perhaps that hit from the Lost Wanderer actually bumped us onto a safe route." Leonard shook his head with a bitter smile, trying to liven up the atmosphere with a cold joke. "I've heard that there are some subtle balance points in the demonic world that can keep things from the human world from deeper pull." "Captain, your joke is too cold," Ronald said, coughing twice. Although he had caught his breath, his condition was not good at all. Cough, cough. "Anyway, the events that happened today must be reported to the church. The appearance of the Lost Wanderer is not a trivial matter. There have been reports of encounters with the Lost Wanderer over the past few decades, but they were all later proven to be just sailors' nonsense or group illusions caused by out-of-control visions. But today we have truly witnessed it. God above, you better be prepared not to be able to sail again in the near future once you return to Provence. I understand, neither the St. Martin's Church nor the authorities of the city of Fairmont will allow a ship that has just encountered a mysterious disaster to return to the sea. This is for the safety of everyone, and what I have to report is not only the church, the city, the Explorers Alliance, and my terrible wife." Captain Leonard pressed his forehead hard, and after a long sigh, he waved his hand. "Enough about this, you need to rest now. Until we return to port, this ship needs the blessing of the goddess." Father Austin nodded slightly, and soon, the chief deputy officer who had just left not long ago returned to the helm room. "No one is missing on the ship, and no one is surplus," Chief Deputy Officer Harold immediately reported as soon as he met. "I personally checked the sailors gathered on the deck, and went to the thermal room to check the mechanics who stayed there. They can all accurately recite the names of their respective gods. They are definitely alive. No one is missing." Leonard widened his eyes. What should be good news, but he couldn't believe the situation Harold reported. "What about the holy light guidance?" "The holy artifact is also normal," Harold immediately nodded. "The navigator is preparing incense and holy ointment, waiting for your command to restart the holy artifact." Leonard listened with surprise, and again muttered softly, "Did he really let this ship go?" "Good luck favors us, Captain," Harold shrugged. "We lost nothing. Maybe that terrible ghost ship captain just happened to pass by, or even accidentally hit it." "Do you believe what you're saying?" Leonard immediately glared at his chief deputy. "If good luck really favored us, we wouldn't have encountered." His words were cut off halfway through. A rush of footsteps suddenly sounded from outside the door, then someone pushed open the door of the helm room. The sweating sailor leader Bernard appeared in front of Leonard, his face full of terror. "Captain! Mysterious item 099 is gone." The helm room was silent for a moment. Everyone looked at each other, but for some reason, Leonard felt a sense of relief in the brief shock. "Great, something wrong was finally found on the ship after the encounter with the Lost Wanderer. That's too right." But then he controlled his facial expression, hurriedly instructed Harold to take over the helm while walking towards the door, and ordered Bernard to lead the way. The urgent footsteps echoed in the long corridor of the birch, and soon Leonard arrived at the deepest part of the steamship under the guidance of Bernard. A special sealed cabin appeared before him. The door of this sealed cabin was engraved with dense mysterious runes. The heavy black door seemed to be cast from a whole piece of black iron. The arcane runes extended from the edge of the door frame to the corridor, as if to form a closed cage to bind the things stored in the sealed cabin. Leonard glanced at the door, confirmed that the door and the surrounding runes showed no signs of damage, and then looked up. The sanctuary, where the holy light guidance was placed, was right above the sealed cabin. The guidance was the key to ensure that the ship was not affected by the abyss, and it was also the second insurance to maintain the sealed cabin. Even in the closed state, it should be able to ensure the integrity of the sealed cabin's barrier, but even under such conditions where both barriers were intact, the object in the sealed cabin, the most critical cargo that the Birch was escorting on this voyage, mysterious item 099, the puppet spirit coffin, had disappeared. Leonard took a deep breath, stepped forward, and opened the door of the sealed cabin, pushing the heavy door open with force. Inside the sealed cabin, the oil lamp was brightly lit. The oil lamps hanging on 4 pillars almost illuminated the center of the cabin without any dead angles. However, the cargo that should have been placed there had vanished, leaving only several intersecting iron chains and some gray ashes scattered on the surrounding ground. Bernard's voice came from behind Leonard. According to the sealing requirements of mysterious item 099, the light in this cabin is always maintained, and every 2 hours a sailor will come in to reinforce the iron chains around the puppet spirit coffin and sprinkle ashes on the ground of the cabin. But when the lost wanderer appeared, due to the chaotic situation, the sailor who was supposed to be on duty did not enter the cabin in time. He was almost 7 minutes late, and as a result, he found that mysterious item 099 had disappeared. Being just 7 minutes late wouldn't cause that thing to get out of control. At most, the seal would weaken and there would be some movement. The worst-case scenario would be a coffin running around in this cabin. These layers of seals and the Holy Light Guidance's imprisonment are not for show. Leonard shook his head. The current situation is that it has disappeared. The cargo has left this ship, and it has nothing to do with that sailor. Bernard looked a little nervous. Then, you mean? It must be the lost wanderer, Leonard said solemnly. That captain took away mysterious item 099. He paused for a moment, then sighed lightly. Perhaps we should feel lucky. The lost wanderer only takes what it wants. That captain came for mysterious item 099, not our lives. Bernard looked at his captain's face, then looked at the empty sealed cabin. After a while, he hesitated and asked, then, we lost such an important cargo, how should we explain to the Fairmont City Council? Leonard looked at Bernard and patted his shoulder forcefully. The lost wanderer is a natural disaster. We have marine insurance. Does the Royal Insurance Company cover this? If they don't, let the Explorers Alliance issue a new reward for the lost wanderer. Captain, are you a little panic? Shut up. The mysterious green flame, which had previously been roaring fiercely, was gradually dying down, and the surrounding sea was also starting to calm. After having confirmed with the unicorn head that the wanderer had left the dangerous sea area and could now navigate on its own, Alexander removed his hand from the dark navigation wheel. At this moment, he was looking down, his eyes reflecting his body that had once again regained its flesh and blood, as well as the deck of the wanderer, which had returned to its original state after the green flame was extinguished. But he had a feeling deep down, many things were not the same. He could feel that the moment he grabbed the navigation wheel of the wanderer, something had changed. The green fire had connected him with this ship and even with the sea. Even though the flames had now receded, he could still feel this invisible connection, and he could feel every detail of the ship beneath his feet. Alexander slowly closed his eyes. He heard faint murmurs echoing through the dark, deep corridors of the wanderer, which carried a strange sense of familiarity. The oil lamp in the captain's room had somehow been lit, casting a ghastly white light through the iron lampshade. He heard the sound of waves hitting the hull, as if deep beneath the waves, hidden eyes were watching him. But when he tried to locate the source of those gaze, they seemed to consciously hide their presence. Alexander opened his eyes and exhaled gently. The ethereal sail on the mast of the wanderer fluttered in response. He moved towards the stairs leading to the deck, and the ropes next to the stairs wriggled and moved aside. He realized, only after he had chosen to take over the navigation wheel, he had become the true captain of this ship. Captain, we are currently surfacing from the edge of the demonic realm and will soon return to the mortal world. The unicorn head's voice came from the side, but this time it was not through the iron communication pipe installed on the ship, but directly in Alexander's mind. When it came to serious matters, it became much more solemn, not as noisy as before. We were lucky. At the deepest point, we only hovered at the bottom of the demonic realm, and we were barely affected by the abyssal seabed. Mortal world, demonic sea realm, abyssal seabed, and the void land that seemed to be even deeper. Alexander had these words appearing in his mind one after another. He knew these words were pointing to the real situation of this strange world, but he still did not know what these words truly meant. However, listening to the unicorn head calling him Captain, Alexander felt a subtle change in its tone. He even suspected that even if he revealed his identity as Alexander at this moment, the unicorn head would still obey his orders. This was the change that occurred after he took control of the navigation wheel and successfully recovered from the mysterious green fire. But after some hesitation, he still didn't rashly try this, nor did he ask the unicorn head about the demonic realm, the abyss, and the void land. If it was a few days ago, he would indeed be anxious and uneasy, and he would be eager to understand his situation. But now, he didn't seem to be in a hurry. This world has other people, other ships, an orderly society, and other civilizations. This is enough to give him many expectations for the future, and even come up with some plans that are still quite vague at the moment. While lost in thought, Alexander remembered the details of his encounter with the ship that suddenly emerged from the thick fog, remembered the prominent chimney on that ship, and the mechanical structure that directly appeared in his mind when it crossed paths with the Wanderer. That was a steam-powered ship, but the Wanderer looks like a sailing warship from the previous era. Alexander murmured to himself, but that wasn't exactly a steam ship. There were some strange compartments on that ship, which were arranged like some kind of sacrificial site. There were many strange patterns and symbols on the skeleton of the ship, like decorations, but beyond the necessity of decorations. Unicorn Head, Alexander suddenly said. He didn't know what the Unicorn Head was called, so he subconsciously said the nickname in his mind. When we intersected with that ship just now, the man who looked like the captain was shouting at me. What did he say? The Unicorn Head seemed to be indifferent to the captain's nickname for it. It gladly accepted and quickly answered, "The wind and waves were too strong, I didn't hear clearly." "You didn't hear it clearly either?" Alexander frowned. I always feel that his expression was so tragic at that time, as if he was ready to die with me. What he was shouting should also be something very important. It's a normal human reaction to want to die with you, especially the normal reaction of sailors at sea. It's not surprising, and their howls before challenging a powerful force do not require your concern. The Unicorn Head's reply seemed to be taken for granted. Alexander, who was just stepping up onto the deck from the stairs, almost stumbled. He was stunned and twitched the corner of his mouth. Wanting to die with me is a normal human reaction. As soon as he finished saying this, he felt that it was a bit inappropriate, because it seemed to expose the flaws in his captain identity, revealing that he didn't know enough about his self. This might be because the green fire had consumed too much energy just now, or it might be because the feeling of merging with the Wanderer had reduced his alertness. Either way, it made Alexander a bit nervous for a moment, but the Unicorn Head seemed to have not noticed at all. They fear you, it's normal. The Unicorn Head's tone even seemed a bit proud. Anyone sailing on the boundless sea should fear you, just like they fear the gods of the old days and the shadows in the subspace. Speaking of shadows, did you know that a distinguished mechanical craftsman, or possibly a farmer or chef once said? Alexander wisely didn't pick up this topic, because he was worried that he wouldn't be able to keep up if the conversation continued. Moreover, the next second, he was distracted by another thing on the deck. What the hell is this? Alexander stood at the edge of the deck, staring in shock at the thing at the door of the captain's room. It was a wooden box, more than a person long, finely crafted. The black oak was seamlessly pieced together, reinforced with what looked like gold metal, and complex patterns were engraved on the edges of the box, like text or like hieroglyphs twisted on purpose. This box was definitely not something from the Wanderer. Alexander hadn't seen it when he left the captain's room before. The Unicorn Head's voice sounded after a moment of silence. I don't recognize it, but it should be a war trophy. War trophy? Alexander didn't react for a moment. He walked around the box twice. This thing looks like a coffin, but it's much more exquisite than a regular coffin. Wait, war trophy? You mean this thing was taken from that ship just now? A successful hunt, Captain. The Unicorn Head's tone was quite serious, with a hint of flattering tone in between. Your every voyage always returns with a full load. This is a normal performance. Alexander opened his mouth subconsciously, thinking that he hadn't planned to take anything from someone else's ship. What kind of hunt and full load is this? However, thinking about it, Alexander was worried that saying this would not fit his captain image. More importantly, that steam-powered ship had now disappeared into the deep fog of the abyssal sea. Considering the state of the white-bearded captain glaring at him as if he was ready to die together, he figured he probably couldn't return this thing, so he swallowed all his words. He stood in front of the exquisite wooden box that looked like a coffin, noticing that the lid seemed to have loosened and looked like it could be opened with a push. After some hesitation, he placed his hand on the lid of the box. At least, he wanted to figure out what he had brought onto the ship from his demonic realm racing. His body was stronger than he thought, and the lid was not as heavy as he thought. He barely exerted any force, and the dark-looking lid lifted a crack, and then was completely opened by him. Alexander looked inside the box, dumbfounded. A person? Inside the box, a beautiful young woman lay quietly, her silver hair spread out in the box like quicksilver. Her face was exquisite and flawless, and she exuded a noble and transcendent aura. She was dressed in a gorgeous purple-black noble dress, her hands crossed over her body, as if she was in a long sleep. Perfect like a puppet. No, this is really a puppet. Upon closer inspection, Alexander suddenly noticed her mechanical joint structure. A puppet so exquisitely crafted that even Alexander almost couldn't distinguish it at first glance. She was lying quietly in that ornate wooden box, like a lady sleeping in a coffin, waiting for someone to awaken her. Alexander truly felt that she would wake up the next second. But that was just an illusion. The puppet just lay quietly in the box, showing no reaction to the surrounding environment. Alexander watched this strange thing with caution and vigilance. There was nothing strange about a puppet itself, but its overly human-like appearance and the coffin-like wooden box instinctively made him feel a sense of danger. Considering the mysterious process by which this box appeared on the Wanderer, it's no wonder he was on guard. After observing for a long time, Alexander finally confirmed that this gorgeous Gothic puppet in the box would not suddenly jump up and give him a surprise. He breathed a sigh of relief, then frowned and asked the unicorn head, "What do you think this is all about?" "This should be the important cargo escorted by the previous ship," the unicorn head immediately replied. Although it had previously stated that it did not recognize the strange wooden box that suddenly appeared on the deck, its experience with maritime matters was obviously richer than that of Alexander, the fake captain. The box has symbols pointing to the gods on the outside, and there are rivets around the box for securing chains, which may suggest that it was in some kind of sealed state. Transporting sealed items on the boundless sea is a very risky thing. That ship seems to have some background. Sealed? Alexander's eyelids subconsciously twitched, and then he looked at the lid of the box that he had completely opened. When it came to the Wanderer, the lid was broken, so he could easily push it. Although he didn't understand anything about sealing, he believed that the seal of this thing must have expired. So, is this a dangerous item? For those fragile ordinary people, it's very dangerous, but I don't think it poses any threat to you. Such anomalies that can be sealed by special techniques can't resist the power of Captain Alexander. Alexander fell silent, his expression serious, but his mind was in turmoil. The flattery of the unicorn head sounded quite pleasing. If he really was the Captain Alexander, he might have believed it. But he wasn't, so he was quite worried now, because the unicorn head had made it clear that this puppet lying in the coffin was a dangerous item. It's just not a threat to the real captain, although he is now posing as Captain Alexander, and even seems to have taken over his body and gained some power. Alexander is very self-aware. He doesn't think this can make him as powerful as the real Captain Alexander. His understanding of this world, this ship, and even his current body is still too limited. In addition, he also keenly noticed a new strange word in the unicorn head's speech just now, anomaly. Anomaly means something that is not normal, which sounds like a common word, but the unicorn head's special emphasis made him vaguely realize that this word here seems to have a special meaning. Perhaps, in this world, the word anomaly not only means out of the ordinary, but also specifically refers to a certain kind of thing. Like a puppet lying in a coffin. Unfortunately, he had no good reason to ask about this kind of common sense. After sighing about the need to be cautious in gathering information and accumulating knowledge, Alexander frowned and took one last look at the puppet, as if making a certain decision. I should throw it back into the sea. When he said this, there was a hint of hesitation in his heart, especially when he looked at the puppet. This feeling of hesitation was particularly obvious. Of course, this wasn't because the puppet is beautiful, but because she really looked like a living person sleeping in a soul box. When he thought about throwing her back into the sea, Alexander even felt like he was throwing a living person off the ship, but this sense of hesitation ultimately strengthened his resolve because he already knew that there were many strange and bizarre things in this world, although so far he has only encountered a ship called the Wanderer in this world, but even just on this ship, he has already seen a talking unicorn head, a mast that can set its own sails, a never-extinguishing ship lamp. And that strange and dangerous sea, the frightening realm of souls and the endless sea fog, and just now, he ran into a huge iron ship transporting a sealed object on this strange sea, and the object that the ship was transporting mysteriously ended up on the deck of the Wanderer. As a rational and cautious person, he couldn't keep such a thing that was very likely to contain strange and dangerous powers by his side just because the puppet looked pretty. Regretfully, Alexander finally firmly closed the lid of that soul box again. Because he was worried, he found nails and a hammer from the cabin and carefully nailed the soul box again. Finally, he pushed that soul box, containing the puppet, to the edge of the deck. The voice of the unicorn head reached his ears. You are free to dispose of your spoils of war, but I would like to respectfully and humbly suggest that you need not be so cautious. The Wanderer has not added any spoils for a long time. Shut up, Alexander simply cut off the unicorn head's incessant babble. The unicorn head fell silent, and Alexander forcefully kicked the soul box, sending it directly into the sea. The heavy wooden box plummeted straight down from the edge of the deck and fell into the sea, which had returned to its normal color. After a dull sound, it surfaced and gradually drifted towards the stern of the Wanderer. Alexander watched the box drift away with the waves until it was completely blocked by the stern. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. He then looked up at the distance, seeing that the mist on the sea had completely dissipated, and the blue sea was slowly undulating around the Wanderer. The ship had completely left that soul realm and returned to the real dimension. On the nearby sea, there was no trace of the steel giant ship that had briefly intersected with the Wanderer. Alexander frowned slightly, roughly estimating the time that had passed since the two ships intersected and their respective speeds. Given the current situation on the sea, that ship should not have disappeared from sight so quickly. Is this also because of this strange sea? Or is it related to the so-called soul realm navigation? Alexander felt a doubt in his heart, but soon, his attention was attracted by something else. He saw a golden light suddenly appearing in the deep shroud of the clouds above the sea. The golden sunlight gradually filled, as if the heavy curtain of clouds was being brushed away by an invisible hand. The sea, which had been gloomy for an unknown amount of time, was gradually being illuminated by the sun. Alexander stood on the bow of the Wanderer, staring wide-eyed at the disappearing gloom. In this moment, he felt an inexplicable touch. Since he had learned about the existence of this side many days ago, and since the first exploration of this strange ship, the persistent gloom had always covered the entire ocean, making him almost believe that this world had no sun, that this world was forever covered in gloom. Renard sighed. If only there were a book to read on this Wanderer, he wouldn't be so passive. His only source of information here was the babbling Bartholomew, but at this stage, he didn't dare to expose too much of himself in front of Bartholomew. But on the other hand, how could such a large ship not have a single book? Lonely and long sea voyages are an extreme pressure environment for those living at sea. People always need some way to relieve pressure. Ordinary sailors may not have time to read for leisure, but the mighty Captain Renard couldn't possibly be illiterate, could he? Knowing that a captain is a technical profession with high knowledge requirements, even the most crude and barbaric pirates need a captain who can read maps, understand astronomy, and calculate navigation routes. With a doubt in his heart, Renard casually asked. He asked very carefully, trying to make it seem like a casual mention, and Bartholomew's answer was without hesitation. Books? Reading books at sea is a dangerous thing. The deep and the subspace creatures are always waiting for a lapse in the human mind, and the only safe readings are the holy scriptures issued by the temple. They are safe, but they are so boring to read that it's better to wash the deck. You've always been uninterested in the temple's things, haven't you? Renard raised his eyebrows. How could reading a book at sea be life-threatening? And only the temple's holy scriptures can be read safely? What kind of big illness does this vast sea have? Feeling like he had gained a bit more knowledge about this world, but with new doubts arising, Renard had to forcefully suppress these new doubts in his heart. He came to the end of the ship's side, looking out at the endless sea and sky. The golden sun shed a dazzling light, reflecting on the sea was a ripple of fine gold. If not considering the eerie appearance of that sun, this was indeed a beautiful scene. I would like to hear your suggestion. After careful consideration, Renard finally said cautiously to Bartholomew, I am somewhat tired of this aimless journey, perhaps. His words were cut off halfway. An unusual feeling suddenly came from his heart. This feeling came from his connection with the Wanderer, as if some foreign object had suddenly touched the ship. Then, he heard a thud from the direction of the stern, as if something heavy had hit the deck. Renard frowned, and then immediately pulled out the loaded gunpowder pistol from his waist, and with the other hand, he pulled out the knight's sword. Then he quickly ran towards the direction of the sound. A moment later, he arrived at the stern deck, and the object lying quietly on the deck left him dumbfounded. It was the gorgeous wooden box like a coffin. It was the eerie Gothic statue. A chill ran up Renard's spine. He stared hard at the box, whose surface was still wet, as if it would suddenly open on its own the next second. Then, he noticed that the nails around the lid of the box were gone. Those were the nails he had nailed before throwing the box into the sea. They should have been very secure. After standing guard next to the box for several minutes, Renard finally made up his mind. He held the gunpowder pistol tightly in one hand, and with the other hand, he inserted the knight's sword into the gap of the wooden box cover, and then forcefully pried it open. The gorgeous lid creaked open, and the lifeless Gothic statue was still lying quietly inside, surrounded by red velvet, like a sleeping princess. Alexander had been separated from the sunlight for too long. Even on the other side, in his lonely cabin, the thick mist outside the window had long blocked the sun. But now, the boundless sea had cleared. After being separated from the sunlight for a long time, he finally felt the sensation of seeing the sun again in the world on this side. Alexander instinctively took a deep breath and spread his arms towards the direction of the sunlight, while the heavy clouds seemed to respond by rapidly dissipating. At the brightest moment of the sunlight, the giant sphere enveloped by countless twisted golden light streams appeared in Alexander's vision. All of Alexander's expressions froze at the moment he spread his arms to welcome the sunlight. He stared, looking straight at the sky. The sunlight was dazzling, but not as dazzling as he was familiar with. He could clearly see the thing hanging in the sky, see its sphere shell with countless dense patterns, see the brilliant light stream overflowing around it, and against the background of the interwoven light stream, the two ring structures distributed in concentric circles around the central sphere were slowly rotating. Alexander squinted his eyes. He vaguely discerned that those two rings seemed to be connected by countless intricate mysterious marks, as if some supreme power was engraving eternal bonds in the sky, imprisoning the sun in the sky. Alexander didn't get to embrace the sunlight he had been longing for. This world has no sunlight at all. What is that? He asked softly, his voice cold. That is of course the sun, Captain Alexander. The unicorn head's voice was as calm as ever. The sun was bright. If that luminous object hanging high in the sky was indeed the sun, then its sunlight was indeed bright. Alexander didn't know how long he had been staring at the sky until his eyes became sore and unbearable. He finally withdrew his gaze from the clouds. However, the posture of that sun was still deeply imprinted in his retina and deep in his mind. Even if he closed his eyes, he could still clearly recall its appearance, that sphere emitting a faint golden light, the distorted light stream around the sphere, and the concentric ring structure quietly operating around the sphere. The sun was not like this, the sun should not be like this. In the world he was familiar with, even under the sky of an alien planet, the star hanging high in the sky would not look like this. But now he had to accept the fact. He was in a foreign land much farther than he imagined. Even the sun had turned into a form he could not understand. Alexander subconsciously turned his head and looked at the door in front of the tower. By pushing the door inward, he could return to the room where he had lived for many years, return to his lonely tower. But outside that room, the heavy fog had already obscured the whole world, and his familiar hometown, in a sense, was only left with that last 30-square-meter hut. The home that seemed to be able to return as soon as the door was pushed open was actually just another solitary ship in the sea. In the long silence, the voice of the unicorn head suddenly entered Alexander's ears. "Captain, where are we going next? Do you have any sailing plans?" Sailing plan? How could Alexander possibly have such a thing? Although he would like to immediately come up with a comprehensive plan to explore this world, determine the next voyage, but he didn't even have a normal sea map at hand, let alone know what land, what forces are in this world, and whether there is an end to this endless ocean. He had just learned how to drive the Wanderer a few hours ago. But he still started to think, and after a few minutes, he spoke in his mind. Where did that ship that collided with the Wanderer come from? Do you want to go to those castle alliances? The voice of the unicorn head was a bit surprised, and then it started to dissuade. I suggest you better not approach the shipping lanes controlled by those castle alliances, at least not now. Although you are the great Captain Alexander, but the current state of the Wanderer, after all, it's not as good as it used to be, and the Navy and the Knights Templar of those castle alliances will definitely try their best to resist your attack. Alexander was speechless for a while. He suddenly wanted to know what kind of outrageous things this Captain Alexander he replaced had done in the past, so that it seemed that showing a face in the world could instantly stimulate a 25-person adventure team. And listening to the subtle meaning in the unicorn's words, Alexander also realized that the current state of the Wanderer and his captain is not as good as it compliments on weekdays. Dare the ghost captain and his ship dominate the ocean because they dare not return to the port of the civilized world? So another way of saying exile is to travel to the end of the world. Alexander was a bit distressed. He urgently needed to find a channel to understand this world. He must find a way to contact the civilized society of this world, whether it is to survive here for a long time or to solve the mystery and return to his familiar hometown. He cannot continue to drift aimlessly on this endless ocean, but the problem is, the civilized society of this world doesn't seem to think so. The Captain Alexander, in the eyes of the locals, is a world demon who wanders outside the main city, and as soon as he appears in the field of vision, he must pull a 25-person adventure team. Alexander sighed. If there were a book to read here on the Wanderer, he wouldn't be so passive. His only source of information here is that eloquent unicorn head, but he doesn't dare to expose too much of his bottom in front of that unicorn head at this stage. But speaking of which, how come there isn't a single book on this huge ship? The lonely and long voyage is an extremely stressful environment for people living at sea. People always need some means to relieve pressure. Ordinary sailors may not have time to read books for entertainment, but the great Captain Alexander can't be illiterate. You know, captain is a technical job that requires a high level of knowledge. Even the crudest and most barbaric pirates must at least have a captain who can read sea maps, understand astrology, and calculate sailing routes. With doubts in his heart, Alexander casually asked. He asked very cautiously, trying to appear as casual as possible, and the answer from the unicorn head was without hesitation. Book? Reading a book at sea is a dangerous thing. The deep sea and the creatures of the subspace are always waiting for the loopholes in human minds, and the only safe reading is those sacred books issued by the temple, which are safe, but they are boring to read. You have always been not interested in the things of the temple, right? Alexander suddenly raised his eyebrows. How can reading a book at sea be life-threatening? And only that sacred book of the temple can be read safely? What kind of disease does this boundless sea have? It seems that he has mastered a little more knowledge about this world, but with it comes new doubts. Alexander had to forcefully suppress these new doubts in his heart. He came to the end of the ship's side and looked at the endless sea and sky in the distance. The golden sun shed a ray of light, and the reflection on the sea surface was like a ripple of fine gold foil. If you don't consider the sun's too weird appearance, this is indeed a beautiful scenery. I want to hear your advice. After careful consideration, Alexander finally said cautiously to the unicorn head, I'm a bit tired of this aimless sailing, maybe. His words were cut off halfway through, and a strange feeling suddenly came from the bottom of his heart. This feeling came from his connection with the Wanderer, as if some foreign object suddenly touched the ship, and then, he heard a bang from the stern, as if something heavy hit the deck. Alexander frowned, and then immediately drew the powder pistol that had been loaded at his waist, and the other hand drew the knight's sword, and then ran quickly towards the direction of the sound. A moment later, he arrived on the aft deck, and the object lying quietly on the deck made him stunned. It was that coffin-like gorgeous wooden box. It was that eerie Gothic statue. A creepy feeling surged in Alexander's heart. He stared at the still wet box, as if the latter would suddenly open the next second, and then he noticed that the nails around the lid of the box had disappeared. These were the nails he nailed before throwing this box into the sea. They should be very strong. After being alert and confronting the box for several minutes, Alexander finally made up his mind. He held the powder gun tightly in one hand, and the other hand probed into the gap of the box lid with the knight's sword, and then pried it open with force. The gorgeous box lid creaked open, and the lifeless Gothic statue still lay quietly in it, surrounded by red velvet lining, like a sleeping princess. Alexander stared at the Gothic statue for several seconds, and said in a serious tone, "If you are alive, get up and talk to me." Even after saying it twice, the statue still didn't move. Alexander looked at her with a serious expression, finally saying lightly, "Very well, then I'll have to send you back again." After saying that, he immediately closed the lid without hesitation, and then took the tools and nailed a crisscross row of coffin nails to the box. After knocking the nails, he also found a chain and used the original hook on the box to firmly fix the lid. After all this, Alexander straightened up and patted his hands with satisfaction, looking at the coffin he had tightly bound and added a circle of coffin nails, and nodded slightly. "This time you should not be able to rise from the coffin." After saying that, he immediately kicked the box back into the sea without hesitation. Watching the box fall into the water, and watching the box rise and fall with the sea current and gradually drift away, Alexander breathed a sigh of relief, then turned around and left the stern. But halfway through, he suddenly turned around and looked in the direction where the box was drifting away. The box was still floating on the sea. Alexander nodded, turned his head and walked away, and then suddenly turned his head. The box was still floating on the sea, and it had drifted far, far away. "Maybe I should put a cannonball or something in it, so it can sink," Alexander muttered, before finally turning and slowly heading towards the captain's room. "You're a bit harsh on that lady," the voice of the unicorn head echoed in his mind. "Shut up, you call a cursed statue lady? That does seem to be a cursed statue, but what curse on the boundless sea can compare to the Wanderer and the great Captain Alexander? Captain, actually, that lady is quite gentle and harmless." "Alexander. Why is this unicorn head so proud when talking about the curse and bad reputation of the Wanderer and Captain Alexander?" Perhaps sensing Alexander's displeasure in his silence, the unicorn head immediately changed the subject. "Captain, you said earlier that you wanted to hear my advice, specifically. Let's talk about it later. I need to rest for a while. Driving the Wanderer sailing in the demon world earlier has drained my energy. You keep quiet for now." "Yes, Captain." The unicorn head quieted down, and Alexander returned to the captain's room. He came to the navigation table and casually swept his gaze over the sea map. The next second, his gaze suddenly froze. There seemed to be a subtle change in the sea map. The gray and white blotches that originally covered the entire sheet of paper and wriggled like a living thing seemed to dissipate a little bit, and the sea surface around the Wanderer was becoming clear. Is this thing updating the information of the surrounding sea area in real time as the Wanderer sails? Alexander immediately came to the navigation table and focused on the subtle changes on the sea map. But his concentrated state was soon interrupted. In the depths of his mind, the Wanderer sent the signal of contacting a foreign object again, and then, Alexander heard a bang from the side and rear of the captain's room. It sounded like something heavy had hit the deck. "The coffin has returned." On the stern deck of the Wanderer, Alexander stared expressionlessly at the ornate wooden box lying quietly before him. The droplets of water falling from the edge of the box confirmed his memory of throwing the box into the sea was not false. It confirmed that this thing was indeed drifting in the vast ocean not long ago. Such a bizarre situation was enough to send chills down anyone's spine, but for some reason, Alexander felt calmer than he had expected. Perhaps it was due to being aboard this ghost ship, or because he had recently experienced a thrilling soul transmigration and a shipwreck, or perhaps it was because he had been dealing with a similarly bizarre unicorn head for several days. Alexander seemed to have developed a certain immunity to the strange supernatural phenomena of this world. In fact, when he threw this cursed doll into the sea last time, he had a vague feeling that things would not end so simply. He bent down and, as expected, found the nails and chains that had been around the coffin had disappeared. He then used his pirate's sword to pry open the lid of the coffin again. The gorgeous Gothic doll still lay quietly in the center of the red velvet lining, her hands crossed, tranquil and elegant. However, Alexander noticed that the hem of her dress seemed to have been wet by the sea water. A faint smell of the sea came from the inside of the coffin lid. So far, this bizarre doll seemed to have no unusual or dangerous behavior other than returning again and again. But just the act of returning was a standard property of a cursed item. Alexander stared at the doll for a moment, then broke the silence with a half-smile. I suddenly want to satisfy my curiosity. He turned and walked towards the cabin entrance, leaving the doll on the deck with relative ease. He knew that temporarily leaving the doll on the deck wouldn't cause much trouble. Even if she were to lash out, the many living things on this ship could handle it. In the meantime, he needed to do some preparation work. Alexander crossed the stern deck and opened the wooden door leading to the lower deck. He walked down the ancient wooden stairs and arrived in the lower cabin. This was the upper cabin, where the cannons were placed. The old-fashioned front-loading cannons lay quietly on both sides of the cabin, the moldy, blackened wooden covers on the shooting ports, and the dark gunpowder barrels and solid iron cannonballs were stacked between the gun positions, seeming to have accumulated for a century. Alexander's gaze swept over these items that seemed quite aged at first glance, and a thought suddenly occurred to him. On this ship, he had not seen a second human figure besides himself. So who was operating these cannons? Could it be that, like the Wanderer itself, these cannons could load and fire themselves when the time came? What about the ship's freshwater tanks? Were they also self-replenishing? What about the damaged areas? Were they also self-repairing? Or did this ship really have a concept of damage? Questions arose in his mind, but he couldn't think of an explanation. Alexander knew that he still knew too little about this ship. Although he had done some exploration here in the past few days, he had only roughly understood its upper structure. The deeper areas were much more eerie and daunting. Plus, he had been hoping to leave his lonely cabin and return to the normal world of the Middle Ages, so he hadn't focused much on the Wanderer. This resulted in his actions on this side lacking motivation. But now, he suddenly became more curious about this ship, or rather, he developed a stronger sense of control. This was his ship, and he should get to know this Wanderer. Perhaps this was also a change that occurred after he took hold of the helm. Alexander shook his head, temporarily putting the exploration plan in his mind, then came to the place where the cannonballs were stored. A few moments later, Alexander, carrying several cast-iron cannonballs, returned to the stern deck. As he had expected, the cursed doll was still lying obediently in the wooden box. Did she make any moves just now? Not at all. The voice of the unicorn head came immediately, as if it had been stifling for too long. This lady is as quiet as she looks. You should trust my judgment, she is harmless to you. Since she returned to the ship again and again, it may indicate that there is a connection between her sarcophagus, and the Wanderer. A great gardener once. Silence. Oh. Alexander looked at the doll in the coffin with a blank expression. He didn't know whether she really couldn't move or was still pretending to be asleep anyway. Alexander didn't care. He wanted to satisfy his curiosity. The cast-iron cannonballs, like solid iron balls, were extremely heavy. When executing a trader on the ship, tying one of these cannonballs was enough to sink even the most seasoned sailor. Alexander put 4 into the coffin, then went back to the cabin and brought another 4. 8 cannonballs almost filled all the remaining space in the box. The elegant Gothic doll was now surrounded by a circle of cannonballs, which looked very martial. Elegant, not so much. Weird, definitely. Alexander closed the lid of the coffin again, then pushed the heavy box to the edge of the deck with some effort. Even with his current physical strength, this operation was not easy. Finally, he kicked the coffin into the sea. The heavy splash echoed, and the beautiful wooden box sank straight into the water. Alexander still stood quietly at the edge of the deck, watching the place where the box fell into the water, not moving for a long time. Captain, did you change your mind? The voice of the unicorn head entered his mind. If you regret discarding this trophy, the Wanderer can try to retrieve the box with the anchor. Although this is not the correct use of the anchor said it can try. Silence. But you have been standing at the edge of the deck for a long time. Silence. Oh. Alexander let out a soft breath. In front of the unicorn head, he couldn't admit that his toe was hurting. So he stood at the edge of the deck, hurting for several minutes, trying hard to maintain the seriousness a dignified captain should have. In the end, he almost doubted whether he looked like a stone of remembrance before finally recovering. He then returned to the upper cabin below the deck at a leisurely pace. After waiting quietly for a few more minutes, guessing that the time was about right, Alexander suddenly walked to the stern area of the upper cabin and opened the observation window between the 2 stern cannons, focusing on the movement on the sea. The unicorn head couldn't help but ask, Captain, what are you? I'm curious about how that cursed doll came back, Alexander responded without taking his eyes off the Ross Sea. Because she's a cursed doll? I admire your attitude of not seeking to understand, but I believe that even if she is a cursed doll, there must be a process for her to return to the Black Pearl. She wants to pretend she's dead, but keeps coming back to the ship. I believe there must be a reason for this, and she must have the ability to communicate, but she refuses to communicate now, so I can only try to grasp her pattern of action and forcibly establish communication with her. Hearing Alexander's explanation, the unicorn head was silent for 2 seconds, then tentatively asked, "Captain, it seems, your spirits have suddenly lifted?" "Ah, this is a good sign. Since you woke up last time, your mood hasn't been very good, and you seem to have lost interest in many things. Your loyal first mate and..." "Shut up." "Oh." After the unicorn head fell silent, Alexander continued to observe the raw sea intently, and in his view, the sea surface behind the ship was calm. The ebony box seemed to have truly sunk into the deep sea, no longer to appear. But with the experience of the previous 2 times, Alexander was especially patient this time. He silently calculated the time, waited and observed as time passed. He seemed to not even notice that he was actively expecting the doll to reappear. And then, a small shadow did appear in his field of vision. In a wave, the shadow entered Alexander's view. It was an exquisite wooden box, breaking the sea surface like a lone boat in the waves. The beautiful Gothic doll was standing in the box, holding her gorgeous ebony box lid in a commanding posture, paddling desperately against the waves. A Gothic doll standing in an ebony box, wielding an ebony box lid, and riding the wind and waves. Elegance was not so much, but this was even stranger than 8 cannonballs. Alexander was greatly shocked.